Okay, hello everybody and welcome back to this week's Android lesson. And today's lesson is actually going to be kind of fun. We're going to go through data, which is what you're looking at on the slide here. This is a PDF file, and I'm getting ready to upload this stuff. So I know it's going to be, I know you're like, where are all these great examples and stuff? Well, they're coming very soon. I might even get to it by the end of this week. It's my goal, actually. Along with all these lectures that you don't have access to either. So on today's menu for today we have files and database connectivity, which would be kind of fun, and SMS messaging services. And I've got another supplemental example from last week when I was talking about connecting to the internet as well. So I'll go over that. It basically looks up news groups. It's kind of a news group reader, which is actually kind of sophisticated as well. So, but I'm going to start out talking about data first. And I also solved the problem with the emulators that are built in for the Android development environment. You have to, basically I'm keeping snapshots now and pre-installing the apps onto the emulators before running them simultaneously. And everything seems to be working great that way. So we'll see what happens today when I try to demo it. Okay, so moving right along. So the subtopics from relating to data that I want to discuss are preferences, files, and Sqlite Database, along with content providers and the network, essentially. And in our examples today, we'll go through all of that stuff. So preferences. And I'm sorry I don't have this in a PowerPoint, but it's a PDF file. So we have key value pairs for programs. So in terms of preferences, when we're setting preferences, it's sort of a key value set. So as an example, in a key string, a key would be a string, a value might be a boolean, a float, an integer, or a double. And we've seen this, if you're familiar with the concept of variables and stuff like that, is what we're looking at. So get preferences for access in the activity only. You can actually see what the preferences are and provide a get preferences on a particular number that's associated with the preference, and then you can say what it is, and you can change things. So we'll create some dynamic behavior, because when we start looking at databases and we start looking at file content and I/O, we're really getting into dynamic programming and programming a dynamic environment for which we want to change and have more interactivity and perhaps have the user set some preferences or be able to change things for the user experience. We have a get shared preferences, a string name and a mode as well, and integer value to share the preferences with other activities. Because if you're using a certain username and login, for example, and you're logging into a website or something, you're going to keep that hopefully, so you can use that, and you can get the shared preferences, and the user doesn't necessarily have to keep adding, typing in their name and their password over and over again. The mode here are some examples of these mode numbers, these integers I was talking about before. The mode might be private, the mode world, readable, the mode might be writable. So it's almost very similar to the Unix permissions on files and directories, making it private, readable, or writable. So you can't share preferences across applications or threads, but they can be sent through intents. By parameters. If you're going to get it first and then save it as a parameter and then send it, maybe when using a combination of screens so that you can pass the information back and forth. But you can't share it among different applications or threads, because each application runs in its own thread. So that's basically all separated. There's no inter-process or inter-thread communication along the lines of preferences. But that's kind of a brief review of the concept of the preferences, and these are the methods that you will be using to get the information and then to share it with other activities that are going on within the same application. An example of using the preferences, I didn't put this into, you can cut and paste this code actually and put it into an Android project and run it and take a look. But this one is setting the name as an example, and it's going to be my prefs file. So we're getting the string prefs name in this particular example from the activity, and we're going to share it. We're going to put a shared preference setting is going to be equal to getting the name number, and the 0 corresponds to the mode private, for which we're retrieving that information. It's a private thing. And then on the stop, what we're doing is we're just going to, looks like we're going to share the preference, edit the settings edit, and then we're not really doing very much with it, actually. We're just getting it. So the example doesn't really do very much at all, which is why I didn't bother cutting and pasting it. But if you're curious and you want to use this as a sort of a template for figuring out how to get preferences for your application, you may do that. But it beats having to start from scratch, actually. So you can use what's on the phone already. Use the preferences that are already set. So globally, think of them more like environment variables, I should say. So files, our next topic. So we can get preferences and save them in a file if we wanted to, or we can read files. So we have regular file I/O access. But there are some restrictions we have to keep in mind. Applications can read and write files on phones, and so you can copy the file, and this is the example I'm going to show you actually. You can copy the file along with the app, the APK file, when you install it on the phone, so that it's reading the file from the phone. And then you can update the file, which is interesting. So it's a way of saving data to, yet again, make a dynamic running application. You can't directly read and write. You can't directly read files written by other applications, however, and that's one of the restrictions. So if you think you're going to use a file for the data storage, which, if you think it, go back, I don't know, about 10 years to C programming or something, and people used files all the time. It's like to log information, to save preferences, to do all sorts of different things. And so if you're thinking, that might be an actual easy thing to do, you're probably going to make the step into SQLite Database, probably. Or you might find, it's the same thing in a real-world application. Are you going to use a database, or are you going to use a file to store your data in? Depends on how much work you're going to do, how persistent you want that data, and if you want that data shared among different applications. If you put it in a file, it's only for your application. If you put it in a database, it's all applications that connect to the database that use that table. So it's very similar to the real-world example in terms of application development. To write a file, this might look familiar. It's Java code, actually. It's a file output stream. File output stream, open file output, the string name, and the init mode creates a file that doesn't exist. So your application can go ahead and create the file in the directory, in the location where you're going to use the file, on the phone, I should say. The modes are, again, the private, which is going to be the 0, the mode for appending to the file rather than rewriting, overwriting it, and then readable and writable. So file input stream, open file name, the name cannot contain path separators. It's just the name of the file. So it's basically stored at a certain location, and it's not like you're opening up any file on the phone itself, because you can't. You can only open up files that belong to that particular application, and they're going to be stored with the application in the same area in terms of the application file. Static files. So you can package static files with your application. So this would be in the terms of, if you're going to write a file, if the app's going to write the file. It's not static because it's dynamic. It's written by the app. And then if it's written by the app, it's owned by the app, and it's in the app share. If, for example, you wanted to pre-configure the app with a bunch of settings, or you wanted to have it look at a file and read information from a file, and I have an example that's going to show you that, you can just go ahead and drag and drop it into the resource directory and the text file itself and put the file in there. So, and it's really referred to as the concept of static files because they don't change. They're preset. So you can package the static files with your application and place them in the resource raw data file directory. In fact, it doesn't have to go into raw. I believe the current API will allow you to put it in any resource directory, but this is where it traditionally goes. Generates a resource ID in the R. So the R will actually generate a resource ID. You use the file just like you're using strings that you created. So a lot of people would like to use static files to automate some of the strings and some of the processing that they might be doing. You can read the file using a resource.openRaw resource or .raw my data file, which is what we're going to do in this example. In fact, what we're going to do is I'm just going to put a file in the resource raw directory, have the app open it up, and put it in what's called a toast message, which is just a pop-up screen that's going to show it to the user to the screen. And I'll show you the code for that. In this, this is going to be a different file example. And this is a working example, actually, so you can download and cut and paste this and put it into a working program, and it shows you all the different parts. This one is actually going to be doing for save the data in the local file. So it uses the local preferences to store data. The program that I'm going to use is going to use a static file. So you can not only load data, but you can, basically load it from dynamically created or load it from a static file. So in this particular example, the file has a file name, file preference, cat, and you're updating data that's going to be stored. Why do you want to do that? Well, next time you go to the app, you're still going to have that data, and the data is going to be persistent. So you may selectively go through this one, which is going to give you this app interface here. And I'm going to show you a different one that I have preloaded. I just want to get this to the right place. And it's basically going to be doing a read on a file. And it's going to read it in the same way. It's going to create an input stream, call it file, the object itself. And it's going to open the file, this data file that's going to open. But we're going to use it as a resource. So I'm going to show you that code in a few minutes. So I just want to get this to the data, writing to the file, reading to the file. Okay, so we'll put this here. Let me go out to Eclipse real quick. And I'm getting smart in terms of labeling the projects. This one is called a read file. I'm going to go back through and relabel example 1, 2, 3, 4 to make it more useful. But the ones we're working with today is going to be called database. It's going to read and write to a MySQL database on the phone. I got news, read file, and an SMS demo. For those of you who came in a little later, those are the demos that we're going to do today. So if I look at the resource directory, and if I go into, I don't have it in here, do I? I do not have it in here. I put it in, okay, so I didn't put it in a raw directory. I put it in, as I was saying before, it doesn't really have to go. It has to go somewhere in the resources. I actually stuck it in the drawable where my icon went. And here's the file here. If I double click on the file, you see it's a plain old text file. And the text file says, this is just a plain old text file, thanks Barbara. So it doesn't really do very much significant. I took and I dragged it from the desktop and I dropped it in here. Which is what, it's a fair way of doing it. Or you can use the menu to, file, new, text file. Actually, just plain old file. And then write some code in the file and stick it here. It doesn't necessarily have to go here. It could go, and let me make this bigger because you guys probably can't see this. I just realized it's kind of small. Okay, so I'm out in the resource directory of the project that I created. And in the resource directory, I have a layout, which is going to be my main layout. I've got values down here with my strings in it. I just took and put it in, I created this file, and it's a text file in Notepad. You don't want to put a Word file in there, because it's not going to format it for Word. It's expecting raw text. Otherwise, you're going to get all the Word formatting information appear on the screen, which is probably not going to want. And I dragged and dropped it, and I put it in here. I just want to, because there's a icon in there too, so. And you could create a separate subdirectory, call it raw, if you wanted to. But the old API required you to do that. Now it pulls the file from anywhere, as long as it's in the subdirectory resource. Okay, so what is this file really doing? Well, let me take a look at the main. Let me take a look at the layout real quick here. The layout's just going to look like hello world. When it loads up. Here it is. It's just hello world. It's not doing anything significant. In fact, we don't even have to set anything. It is looking like that. And then the manifest is pretty standard as well. Whoops. No permissions are set, so we don't have to do anything for file I/O for databases. There's no security, problem with that at all, which is kind of different from like Java applets and stuff where we did have security and privileges and stuff. But there's nothing set for this one. Okay, so let's take a look at the source, which is going to be read file activity.java. And this is the significant part of the example. Let me close these guys here. And let me make this a little bigger. There we go. As you can see, all of the regular imports are put in. Why do we have depreciated? No, they're unused. Okay, no problem. So I have some unused includes here. But it's going to read an embedded raw data file for which we need Java I/O for, because we're going to use a regular old Java read stream objects to do it. So I could remove the bundle and the activity. We're not really doing any of those. Actually, I have them up here, so that's probably why. In fact, I'll just take that out now, actually. Clean this up a little bit while I'm here. Okay, so let's see. The public class read file activity is going to extend activity. Fairly basic. This is just like how our hello world's been so far. On the create, we're going to call the super on create. Nothing new. We're going to pull the R file, our layout main, to get the values that are going to be, well, there's nothing in main. We're just going to need to write to it. But in the R, we actually have the file information. We're going to catch an IO exception, and we're going to put here a toast message. If you're not familiar with toast, it's sort of like setting up a little message dialog box, and we'll see what the toast looks like today. I'm not sure if I've shown you this yet. But the toast message is nothing more than a simple dialog box. It's not really a dialog box, I should say. It doesn't have a border around it. It's just like a little message that flashes on the screen. So we're going to get the application content problems, and we're going to print out essentially the error message, hopefully, onto the screen in a toast message. If there's a problem, after we run play with raw files. So the try in here, and this is kind of typical actually, to put in the onCreate a method call to the method that we're going to run or a function if you want to call it that. In here, so it's less code. It looks a little bit more readable. So all the program is doing on the onCreate is performing a try on play with raw file function call. And then if there's an error message, then print the error message to the screen, like the file doesn't exist or something, which is basic file I/O. That might look extremely familiar to those people who have written this in Java before. It's the same text. It's the same source code that you would normally see in a Java program, except for it's running on the Android. And we're calling the method play with raw files, and we're throwing an IO exception. If you remember that from the Java course, it's the same concept again. And so we're going to create a blank string. The string str is going to be equal to nothing. It's 0. It's empty. And then this string buffer. This is the same thing we did in the object-oriented programming course in Java, where we just created and used, and this is a buffered I/O, so it just has different inheritance. It's different level in the inheritance. But string buffer buff is equal to new string buffer. Create the string buffer, and then input stream is, name of the object is is. This.get resource, and this is the interesting part here. It's open raw resource r.drawable.test file, which is the location, because the R file archives everything in the resource directory. So that's why I was kind of showing you before. I put it in the drawable. I put it in over here. And this is the trick, because most people can figure out how to write the source code. It's just like reading and writing files. But in a Java application, the biggest question is, well, where do you put it? So I put it here. And in terms of the way that this text is written, it goes and looks in all of the drawables. And the drawables, by default, are for your different they're for your different screen resolutions, your different settings, depending upon, but by default, if it doesn't find it in the first one, it goes to the second one, goes to the third one, goes to the fourth one. So it's going to find it in the first one along with this test file. But there's different versions of the icons as well if I open this up in the other ones. So yeah, it just basically have to stick it in one of the drawables if you're going to do that. The other point you could do is you could create a directory, and I won't do that, but you can create a directory and call it raw and put it in the raw directory if you wanted to. And then if you're going to do that over in the source code, instead of saying drawable, you would say raw.test file. And test file is the name of the file. I didn't put a file extension on there. You don't need to. It's going to assume that it's a text file every time you load it. And now we have a buffer reader. This is the same as Java I/O that we looked at in the last class. It equals a new buffer reader, new input stream, and make the input stream on the object is, and the object is the input stream that we're creating from this test file. So it's going to read everything and then put it all back out for us. So if is doesn't equal null, which we haven't hit the end of it, while the string equals readline, this is the same thing we did with the file I/O, doesn't equal null, then buffer.append the string and then put a line return at the end. So it's going to read a line by line and then put a line return at the end. And then we're going to close the file. so is.close. And then we're going to put a toast message up here, and it's basically toast.makeText, make text, get base context, and base context, well, it's going to be the buffer.toString, and the buffer.toString is this object that contains all of the lines that we've read from the file. And then toast.length long, well, don't worry about the toast parameters, but we're going to word wrap it. We're going to make the length of the toast box big enough to store all of the lines that we have in the file. And the file itself is interesting because I put blank lines in there. In the file, let's just take another look at the file before I run it, so you can kind of compare to see what you see here. See, I've got 1, 2 blank lines in here. This is exactly how it's going to look, because it's going to read this line, it's going to read this line, read this line, read this line, read this line, and then make the toast message big enough to hold all of those lines. So let me go ahead and run it, and let me make this smaller here. So it's reading the file. Actually, I have it already pre-installed on my emulators. And I have 2 emulators up because I'm going to be text messaging back and forth between them in a few minutes. Here's the read file. So you see the little toast that comes up, and it just comes up for a second and then it goes away. So I'll run it one more time just in case you didn't see it. But look at the bottom of the emulator screen. This is the toast. This is a plain text file. Thanks, Barbara. That's not what I would call the best way of doing something, but I'm going to show you in a few minutes another program that does it, and you'll see that those toasts are kind of tricky. If you leave the toast up, in fact, I can show you right now with this one probably. If you close the file, the toast still stays there. Oops, wrong program. Let's see. Oh, it wouldn't let me close it. I couldn't close it fast enough. Well, we'll see it again. It's interesting. You can put toast messages in background processes, actually, or create applications that run as background processes. And the toast will just keep coming and going and going and going after the application is closed while you're in something else. So a lot of people sometimes use those toast messages as a warning. As an example, we're gonna be talking about text messaging in a few minutes. So I have a newsgroup example that I put in here only because it has some really nice toast messages in there. And the toast messages just keep going after you close the application. It just knows what it's supposed to do. And it's interesting because if you have a text message program, what do? Well, they put up a message, hey, new text. And it shows up on your phone. And you click on it and it takes you to the text message program. Well, so the demonstration is going to show you, well, you can implement that quite easily yourself. You can write your own text message program, actually. But you can customize the behavior as well. So, but going back to this test file example, that one is just really trivial. It's doing nothing more than opening up the file, and the file is located in the project. If you go back to and you look at the example that's in the lecture, you can see that this one's going to be writing a file to the phone. And basically that's your only 2 choices. You either ship the file with the program and you can still read and write to it, or you create the file and the file becomes part of the program. It's not static, it's more dynamic because it's created with the program. If you create the file ahead of time and ship it with the program, you're guaranteed to have the file. So the program's guaranteed to run. If you rely upon the user experience to create that file, you may or may not be able to create, depending on is there enough room on the SD card. Because it's going to be stored in a slightly different location, obviously. It's not going to be packaged in with the application and guaranteed to run. It's going to be something that's going to be determined on the fly when the user creates the file. So given the amount of space that might be available as a text file, I'm pretty sure there'll be enough space. But it may not necessarily be guaranteed that you're going to actually have that file written correctly. So that was, believe it or not, everything you need to know about file I/O. So, databases. You don't have to install a database. In fact, you don't even have to do it on the emulator. It's already there. And we have SQLite. Oh, what is SQLite? It actually reminds me of MySQL, actually. If you go to this directory here, let me just make sure it works, www.sqlite.org. Here it is. You can read all about it. And we have lots of sponsors, Nokia, Oracle, contributing to the project. So its software library implements a self-contained serverless, zero configuration, transactional SQL database engine. So it's used for most widely developed SQL database engine in the world. Okay, public domain, open source, and all you need to know is it's already on your phone or your tablet, and it's basically the database that's going to be used for tablet or for iPhone, or excuse me, for Android phone application development. So it's embedded SQL database engine. It's free. The source is public domain. It supports the concept of transactions, and the file format is cross-platform compatible. So we can install the same database on an iPhone, and we install it on an Android phone. And the database engine is fairly typical, fairly standard in terms of SQL. Works with standard SQL statements, and you can configure a table in there just like you would in a regular old database. So it's very easy to work with if you have a background in databases, that is. So a lot of people would use the database, as I was mentioning before, because the database is global for all applications that are running on the phone. So if you're using the text file option, you're opening and closing them per application. The database is going to give you that global kind of data sharing. So what things could be accessible through the database would be application-related data. Your contacts, your other resources are going to be stored elsewhere. So the database is really just for database connectivity, I should say, within it. So key Android database classes, the ones that we're going to be using: Android database.sql, Lite.sqlite, Open Helper. It's basically the database creation, the version management, the database access. And then we have the SQLite database, which is going to have the create, the delete, the execute, and SQL command statements. It's very similar to a JDBC interface, actually, where you're using a standard API that's going to be performing the connectivity tasks that you're going to need. And then we have the database cursor, which is very similar to the cursor concept in a real database. And the cursor is the temporary information that gets retrieved after you run the query. That's usually residing on the database, but you have to think this database is on the phone, so it's serverless. There's no client-server relationship. Instead, you're on the server, and the database is looking and acting like a server, sort of, but it's serverless, so it's really a client, right? Because it's a client phone. So it doesn't really fall into the whole, log into the database, connect to the database, give a username and password, because you're already in the database. So you don't have to go through any of that stuff. And you can read the cursor information because you're on the server. You're there. So it's a read-write access to the results set. So in essence, you're not passing any information back and forth. You can use the phone, however, to log into external databases. When you log into an external database, you're logging into a feature. You're connecting to a database to do a query on a book or something, or creating say for example, you're Amazon. You're not going to put the Amazon database on the phone. Instead, you're going to use it as a client to connect to the regular old web service that runs the Amazon database. So in terms of the application development and the involvement in terms of the database connectivity and the usage, slightly different, more like a file actually versus a true database application. I certainly wouldn't put an accounting program on here, but you could. So it just means, you're not going to be able to, well, you can export the information out. You can dump the tables, the data out, and import it into like a PC program or something. But it's really not meant for full-fledged application use, and I'm going to show you a use of it today as a contact list. So in terms of the Sql Open Helper to create the database object itself, we have the synchronize void close any open database objects. We have a command here to get readable database to create and or open the database. So we can open the database, close the database, get writable database, open the database, and will be used for reading and writing. Or call in the database on the onCreate. We have the abstract void onCreate, and then we can onCreate Sqlite database object. So it's called when the database is created for the first time. And then we have an onOpen also, called when the database has been opened. So on an open on a database, you might want to set a few things. You might want to run a query or something. And then on an upgrade, called when the database needs to be upgraded, because everything on the all of the software applications on the phone can be upgraded on a routine basis when things get changed. And the database itself will need to be upgraded eventually. So Android databases in particular, accessible to all classes in an application. So as well as files, or you can move the data back and forth between different classes. They are essentially all open as well, but can't access directly databases from other applications. So there is that limitation as long as the application class, as long as the class is part of that application, it can access and log in. But other applications made by other vendors and things, you could probably think it's just for security purposes. Other applications that are created are going to be able to use the database, but they're not going to be able to use the database object that's created for your application, and vice versa. So the design of the application becomes a bit interesting because you have to enclose it all into one application. So if you have a reports module that's going to be running reports on, let's say you created an address book, and you're going to have basically all of the features in one app that you're going to create. You're not going to have multiple apps that run with it. But there are ways of configuring it so you can duplicate the information for multiple app purposes if you're going to break your apps out. Database errors are logged. You can actually look at the log to see what's going on. And you can connect to databases on phone from a shell. You can actually connect using a terminal window, just like you do with a command line prompt to Oracle or MySQL database. So the reference here is going to be a different one than before. It's on the Android debug bridge. There's information in here on the database tools and the debug tools for figuring out what's going wrong with my database and looking at the log files. So this might actually be a good link for you as well. But if you're interested in getting more specific details about the database and in terms of its features, this is an excellent source. You don't have to install it though. It should be installed already on the emulator if you're using the emulator. So in this particular example here, I'm going to show you a different one, and for a different reason actually. But here we're going to show you the creating the database, inserting, updating, deleting, and querying through the database, which is kind of typical. So I mean, insert, update, read, delete, and these are some information that we're going to use in terms of the query that we're going to create. I'm going to just create functions for each one of the options. So I'm going to kind of go through the functionality so you can kind of see how it comes together, and then I'll show you a live one that I've created that stores an address book. It's slightly different, but it's doing the same concept, but in a slightly different fashion. I'll show you that in a few minutes. But so here we have database version is 1, the database name is name.database, and the database connector that's going to essentially set the context to the database, and then the onCreate, as I mentioned before, when the database is opened, the onCreating, the open of the instance of the object of the database, it's going to run a create table names with an ID and an integer, name and text, essentially. You know what? I believe that this is the example. This might actually be the same example I have for you. Insert, and then this is a query. We're going to execute SQL. And so what we're doing is creating the name database object. Creating the object, passing it to here, using this as a reference for name database, execute query, execute query, execute query, yada yada. So it's basically just going to run a bunch of queries. And the queries are going to run the DML and the DDL commands. So we're going to create the table and the names and the ID, and we're going to insert into names these values. And then we're going to upgrade. Well, we're not going to upgrade. We just put the method in here. It's required to be in here. So if you leave the method out, even though you may not necessarily have any code to put in there, what happens when the database gets upgraded? Well, when the phone actually updates it. You might want to recreate stuff. You might want to count up something. I don't know. You might want to delete stuff. Who knows? It might not be compatible with any updated databases or something. But you can put in code here. If you don't have the method, you're going to get an error, so you have to actually include the method template, even though there's nothing in there. And then for the main class, this is basically the database connectivity, so the database helper. And going back to kind of the template, putting this together, what we're looking at is the Open Helper. Well, what we're looking at, I thought I had this in the previous slide idea. We're looking at these items here with the Open Helper, the database commands themselves, and then the cursor, reading the information from the cursor. I cursor is like our result set. But in a normal client-server database, our client, we connect to the server, and we have to have a connection, we establish the connection, and we have to send a query, and then we get a result set back. So if we're on the server, we don't have to connect to it. We just open it. Create an object, we just open it. We don't have to, when we run a query, we don't have to wait for a result set to come back. We have it right here. And what we have is the cursor. So the cursor replaces the result set. So there's less traffic going back and forth because there is no traffic. We're all on the same computer, all on the same server. Okay, so in the database example here, the main class extends the activity implements view, same stuff as we've seen before so far. We've got a text, database text name, a database name, database ID, database name, database helper variable. And here we're running the onSuper, same as before, to the onCreate from the superclasses object. So we can do this onCreate, then the previous onCreate. And we're doing the same thing before, setting the context view to r.layout main. And we're putting out some buttons. Those were the buttons that we saw before to insert, to update, to read, to delete items from the database. And then we're just going to set up these function calls, essentially. And we're going to set the text first, though. So the database text is the edit text. This is what's in the text field. This is the text name. This is the helper information. And then display the database record. So each record is going to have the ID and the name associated with them. And then for the database object itself, a database object, to continue along with it, the displaying the database record, it displays the running the display database record on each one of the strings. So getting the value for each one of the strings so we can display it. And here's the method here for that. So this is just basically going to call it, to display it's going to call the database record. And the database record is going to essentially go through a loop and print out all of the information that's associated with it. And we're going to have our normal gets and sets, to get the name, set the name, get the ID, set the ID. It's kind of like the normal method calls that we would normally put into a Java application. And then on the click, this is the event handler for the buttons. So on the onClick event, it's going to do a bunch of cases and says, well, if it's the button is the read button, then display it. If the button is the delete button, well then delete it. And if the button is insert, then perform an insert. And what's different about all these is the query, essentially. And getting the information that's going to be inserted or getting the information that's going to be deleted and incorporating that, and setting the right string variables so that we can incorporate that into the query correctly when we run it. So let's see what that looks like. And I conveniently labeled this one database. So we have a database. What do we have in our database? Well, we're going to have a resource file. And the resource, this is going to be a slightly different example. This one here actually works just fine if you, well, I closed it already. If you cut and paste it and make the different parts from the file, it actually does work. I've tested it. But I ran across this example here that I like a little bit better, only because it does slightly different behavior. It uses multiple resource files. So I'm going to close that file. Don't need to save that. And so the layout has two resource files to it. Just a little bit bigger so you can kind of see the graphical layout of the program. Where we're going to have here multiple different items that are going to be in a list that are going to be associated with the contents of the database that we're creating. And it's kind of a crude way of showing SQL results, but it's showing you essentially just instead of going, the example that I gave you in the PDF file is showing you one record at a time, or it's not, actually it wasn't showing you any records at all. So this is going to do a query and populate out the interface to show you everybody that's in the database, which is nice. And then allow you to search people in the database and delete people from the database. Actually, I did not put a delete button in there, it's just a search button. So the interface is going to be using a linear layout, horizontal. It's going to have an edit text, so it's going to have a button, and then it's going to have a list view, and the list viewer is going to show everybody who's in the database. So it's just kind of a generic list, and a search button, and a search text, so we can, pull a name out of the database. So it's kind of like an address book. Think about it. The employee list item is the interface that shows up for each one of the. So if we double-clicked on the list item, we're going to get the employee list, and the employee list is the contact list. It's the information that's going to be in a separate form that comes up that's going to essentially, or XML interface I should call it, that's going to have a text view on it, that's going to have a first name, a last name, a title. And each one of these things is going to be stored in the list view. So we have first name, last name, title for each one of the items that are going to be in our contact list. So the interface on here was the significant part that was different from the lecture example that I gave you. It's only because it's showing you a little bit of nesting in terms of the interface. The rest of it is pretty standard. If we go back up and take a look at the source real quick, see what the source is doing. I separated out so we have database helper and then database activity, which is essentially what the slide set was doing for us, except for it was putting it all together into one database activity. Shut these here real quick so you can see what I'm doing. So this one is the database activity, and the database activity is going to set some fields for the edit text for the search, or excuse me, the database itself. It's using a Sqlite database, and if we look at the imports, we can see we have the Android database cursor. Hopefully this is big enough for you to see. And the database Sqlite database, which is basically the standard packages, and this works with 2.3 all the way up to 4.0 as I've tested it, of the API releases, or I should say the operating system releases. So if I take a look at here, same thing that you would actually kind of experience in a regular old Java application, where we have the information that's going to be stored for the items. So the variables created for the text GUI interfaces for the search text, the cursor, the adapter, the employee list, as in terms of the list view. So called when the activity is first created, we have the onCreate, same as before. This kind of gets a little redundant after a while, so that's why I'm kind of skipping through it. Here's our onCreate. It's going to call the super onCreate. It's kind of the same thing as before. Set the context view to the layout main. So R is layout main. And then now we have the object, the DB object. Well, this is going to be equal to a new database helper, this. So this example I like because you're creating an object that's not in this object. So it's actually calling and creating this object here. It's referring to the database helper.java. And this is, we've had another example that was similar to this that separated out the objects themselves, but it really is a separate object, the database object that's being called. So DB is going to be equal to a new database helper, this, get writable database, create the database. And I'll take a look at that in a few minutes. Search text is going to be equal to, and we're pulling this out of the XML file. We're pulling it out of the interface. It's going to be equal to whatever happens to be in the edit text box for the search text, and whatever happens to be in the list view for the employee list is going to end up in the employee list item. And that's going to be from the resource file and the IDs of the search text in the list, as we've seen before in the XML file. So the functionality for the search is kind of interesting. It's going to be a regular old database query. So the cursor is going to be equal to the database raw query, and this is where we just put the raw query in here. And the raw query is, select ID, first name, last name, title, from employee, where first name. And then we have these here, these marks here, that are going to append. So it's going to concatenate the operation in Sqlite. So we can concatenate the information together. And then we're going to create a new string out of that. New string is going to have get text to string for the search text. So whatever happens to be in the box, you typed in Joe Smith, you pressed search. So from the search text, it's going to convert it to a string, concatenate, or actually, it is concatenating it or appending it essentially to the query that we have written so far, and put it all in a text format. Is what we're doing. We're creating a new string out of it because we don't actually get that in a string form. We have to convert it to a string when it comes out of that text box. And the adapter is going to be equal to a new simple cursor adapter that's going to be from the rLayout employee list item, which is the list items for each one of the employees, which is the first name, the last name, the title. From the cursor, first name, last name, title, create a new integer that value for the R, first name, last name, title, and then set the employee list set adapter to the adapter, which embeds the employee list inside of the list view, which is inside of main, or part of main. So it's kind of trivial, and it makes it small. I shouldn't say trivial. It's kind of simple code, actually, for what it's doing. If we take a look at the database helper, what we're going to get here is same includes as before. Similar, I should say. They're a little bit of a difference. But this is the database helper class, and database helper class is going to set the database name to employee_directory. It's going to create a directory of employees, obviously. And it's going to set the context to the database name and to the first item in the database. So it sets it, kind of sets the context to open it up, so it makes it ready to be queried. And then on the create the employee table and populate it with some sample data. So it's going to create the table if it doesn't exist. So the first time the customer actually runs the application, it's not going to be there because it hasn't been created. So it should create the table first and then populate it with some information. And we're going to populate it with first name Joe, last name Smith. Joe Smith's going to be the engineer. No, he's going to be the CEO. He's going to put some telephone numbers in here. And then we're going to have Robert Johnson, VP, and a bunch of other people. Marie Potter, and okay. A bunch of people are going to be added to the database. And on the upgrade, when the database is upgraded, we're going to drop the table if it exists, which is kind of an interesting concept, which means the next time we open up the database after we have had some sort of a database upgrade by the vendor, by our operating software, then it's going to recreate the table for us and make it fresh, which means on an upgrade, sometimes files are replaced that are necessary. Sometimes the entire database itself is reset. So it's kind of a way of making sure that your app survives the update. If it's going to put some default data in here, it's going to be kind of inconvenient for the user who has populated this, but our application isn't populating it with any information outside of not allowing the user to populate it with information. You can easily make this same application create addresses by just having a separate input button that says, add, and then put the first name, last name. Have the, actually create an XML interface that provides fields for all of these different items, and then have an add button. And the add button, instead of doing an insert, it's going to be doing an update, or it's going to be doing an, instead of doing this is doing an insert, so it's going to be doing the same thing, but it's going to be doing it from an add button instead. So let's see what it looks like. And any questions on the database connectivity or the file example that I gave you before? Okay. I believe I have database on here, but let me just check real quick. For those of you who came in a little bit later, I fixed the emulator problem. So it keeps a snapshot, and it doesn't fail on me anymore. And so I have two emulators actually running right now. And you just keep the emulators up. You make it do a snapshot, and you give it an SD card. And you load it before you start anything else. Actually, you can load them before you even go into Eclipse if you want to. And you just keep them up and don't take them down. And I tweaked them both so that they weren't using very much memory, and that they were, because they were set really high. And so if I run multiple emulators and then my recording software, it was just really bad. But I'm going to pick this emulator right here. It's the same emulator. They're both online to run the application. And it's not that emulator. Now I've got to find the right emulator. It's in the background. And as soon as I say I fixed it, it doesn't work. It should be loading. Let's take a look at one of them's like, here it is. Still takes a bit of patience. And kind of the interesting phenomenon, the reason why I went back to this and had to make this work was because the next example I'm going to show you is in regards to text messaging. And if you're using VirtualBox and you're trying to set text messages back and forth between the emulators, you have to have two separate IP addresses. It's a battle enough just to get one emulator IP address known and linked and connected to the ADB manager. It's more work to actually load the two emulators. It takes up more memory with two of those guys loaded. And then it's hard to get from VirtualBox. You get a denial sometimes, and it's really hard to configure the second emulator with a brand new IP address that's not the same as the first emulator because it's trying to share it by default. Because it only expects you to run one instance of that virtual machine. So if you're running two instances of it, it gets confused between it. So this is actually creating the, it wasn't on here before, so This is probably why I have this little round thing going. I'm hoping it's not going to, there's a good sign it says database up here. I'm going to be patient, though. I'm going to let it run its course, because I know this works. I tried it on the emulator, actually. But it hasn't been, the database has not been created on these emulators. It's been created on my VirtualBox. So I'm going to take a quick look here at the status on the bottom. No, we're doing good. We're doing good. Starting the activity, ITU database. Make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on down here. It installed the database, APK. It said successful. Starting the activity now for the database activity. Starting the intent. So it's trying to build the database right now. I still don't have an error message yet, so I'm going to leave it alone. Watch it be hosed. Let's see. I was seeing if it was on this one here, actually. It's not. Oh, here it is. Actually, it is on this one. The database has actually been created on the second emulator. So I just clicked on it, actually. Here it is. No, the database data is having an issue. Alright, so the first emulator that was loading it, not loading it. Second emulator, I swear this application does work. The second one has seemed to have lost its memory. And I don't believe it probably can load it because I have two emulators running simultaneously and it's having an issue. So you're gonna have to take it and run it on your emulator at home. So I'm gonna hopefully exit out and go home on this guy. Let's see if I can get this guy unstuck. Otherwise I have to reload him. Okay, he's being reloaded. Alright. Yeah. It might actually load up, you know, but it may not be till tomorrow. So I'm sorry? Yeah. I could load it on that one. Actually, I didn't load the VirtualBox because I loaded two of these guys up. Because I want to show you the oh, wait a minute, what happened here? How did I get to that? Okay, so I got an internet access, that's good. Alright, well, I'm going to kill this emulator. Actually, you know what? I'll do that. This is number 232. Oh, wait a minute, something just happened. Something just flashed. Alright. Let me reset the other emulator so it can start while I'm giving you the PowerPoint stuff. When do I have? 232. Let's refresh it. Let's just refresh it. No, that's not going to do it. Alright, let's just leave it alone. This is really a bummer. Okay. No biggie. It'll time out hopefully while I'm doing the second part of the lecture. See, it's something really weird. Just flipped again. Okay. Alright, so that was the failed demonstration of the database. It does work, however. So I'm going to close a few windows here, make the memory usage a little bit lower. And switch on to our next topic for today, which is going to be Lecture 6 and SMS. So what I'm showing you today are some miscellaneous features in terms of the file example, the database example. And I'm glad the file example worked, actually. That was a refresher. I have one example at least work. So this next lecture is going to be on the concept of SMS, and then I have an SMS example where hopefully we're going to get two working emulators back up, because you need two emulators. But I can actually send to the emulator, if I only have one up, I can send to it from the DDMS, and I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes as well. But let me talk about the concept of SMS messaging first. So what we're looking at is this is sending and receiving text messages. And I know your phone does this already. However, you can create a customized application that uses the same protocols in the same manner, but it might give you different status or might automate something for you. I don't know. It might give you a little pop-up window instead or something, or take away the pop-up window, put it in a notification box or something of that nature, which is kind of fun. So we have a couple different ways of doing it. We have intents and intent filters. So this is another example of the intent concept. Intent requires the intent requests for an action to be performed, supports interaction among the Android components. We can use intents to go to the market app or to go to the content to get things out of the market. We can use it for making a telephone call. We can use it for a text message interface. For an activity, it conveys the request to the to present an image to the user as if it were a seamless kind of integration. We have broadcast receivers, where the intent object names the action being announced. And the example I'm going to give you is going to use a broadcast receiver, actually. So the intent filter registers the activity, the services, the broadcast receivers as being capable of being performed on a set of data. And we have to set a permission, actually, that allows us to use, so we have to set a receive SMS or a send SMS type of permission as well in the manifest. So in step number 1, in the manifest file, we have 2 permissions that are going to need to be set, as I mentioned before, and I'll show you a true example of this with source code in a few minutes. But the send SMS and then the receive SMS, which is basic. And why they broke it out into 2, I'm not sure. Except for maybe we want to prevent applications that are supposed to receive. Maybe, I don't know. And the example I'm going to give you looks exactly like this. It's the same example. So you'll have the source code for this as well, as soon as I get around to uploading them. In the main.xml, we're going to add a text box, a text view to display or enter the phone number. Obviously, we need the phone number on the top. What are we going to use for the emulators? The ports, which is kind of the reason why I was using the Android emulators, because I have port IDs associated with them. Well, I get ports on the virtual box too, but unfortunately they rely upon the internet connection, the IP connection, and the IP addresses are sort of bound to the socket. So they're using a socket abstraction, where the emulators for the Android are making a false assumption that it exists, and they're pretending like it does. So let's see. We're entering the phone number, the recipient, we're typing in the message on the bottom. We have the edit text with an ID for the telephone number and a text message. And then we're going to add a button called send right down here on the bottom. And then we're going to get messages that are going to show up in the form of toast messages, the same as before. So we import the classes, and here's pretty standard imports, telephony, and I believe that's depreciated. I have a newer class, actually, newer imports from this library. This is based upon an older API. However, it still does work. This example does work, but I did upgrade the import on that telephony.sms manager. The input from the user, i.e. the telephone number, the text message, and the sending SMS message implemented in terms of this following method. And this method here is what we're going to use to write the SMS class, or excuse me, this is the text that we're going to use to write the generic SMS class, where we've got the SMS extends activity, and we have the button for the sending and the telephone. We have an edit text for the telephone number, edit text for the message. And then when the activity is first called, it's going to uncreate. It's going to do the same thing as before. It's going to set from the r.id for each of the 3 items. It's going to set the information with the variables that are set inside of the program, in terms of the uncreate method. And then we're going to run a send text, essentially, on an on-click listener. So when the user clicks send, it's going to call the method, make an instance of the object to send it, call the method to actually send the message, populating the information with the right, the strings with the right information from the GUI. And then here's the toast message on the bottom. We'll see the toast message. I believe I probably put a different message in there, but it's the same toast message we saw in the previous example. It's a little pop-up screen. So step number 5 is to send, to send an SMS message. You're going to use the SMS Manager class. So we're going to add to instantiate this class with a default or get default static method. And so the send text message method sends the SMS message with the pending intent. The pending intent object is used to identify the target to invoke at a later time. And here's kind of like what the generic kind of format looks like. So we have the pending intent PI. It's going to be a get activity on the SMS class. SMS manager get default. Get default is going to get the default information for the port for the setup of the actual transmission for use with the intent. And then in terms of sending, and this is sort of what it looks like. We've got the hello greeting from Android, and we're going to put this is going to be what I'm going to demo to you live in a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend too much time going through it. But this is what it's essentially looking like. And then step number 1 here, this is an old example because the r.java file is in here, which it shouldn't be in here. Actually, it should be down lower. And the example I'm going to show you is a more recent version of it that was recreated. But using essentially these particular classes that are created for sending and for receiving messages. You can break it all out actually to different classes for it. So in the Android manifest file, we're going to add receiver element so that the incoming SMS can be intercepted by the SMS receiver class. And if we add this, then we're going to add the android.provider.telephony.sms receive, which means that this is able to intercept and receive the message instead of the default text message program that would come up and receive it. And you know you have problems when the default stuff comes up instead of your application. And then you can just set the permissions and or set the intent correctly. So, in terms of step number 3, receiving the SMS, we're using the same kind of API calls as before. And what we're looking at here in terms of it is, in the SMS receiver class, extending the broadcast receiver class and overriding the onReceive method, and the message is attached to the intent, and the intent sends the message to the application so that the application can put it in the toast message or put it wherever it needs to go, like in the upper or lower part of a box or something. And so the message is stored in an object array, a PDU format. To extract the message, use the static create from PDU. So the text format itself is in a kind of a, it's in a format for which you have to parse and extract the information to be used for display, like the from, the to, the text body. So it's basically like the body of an email message in a lot of ways, where you have to extract the different parts of the message, or the packet, I should say. So the SMS message is then displayed using a toast class at the end of this. And so if we have 2 Androids set up, we can send one to the other by using the port number. And here 554 is going to 556, and then we have a little toast message that comes up on the bottom with, SMS from this was sent, or something was received. So if you'd like more information, these links actually still work, even though they are about a year old. The informations do work, and there's some really good examples actually out here. Some of the examples here, the SMS messaging in Android, it's very popular because it's kind of straightforward in terms of some of the other ones. So you're more than welcome to look at the examples. This was lecture number 6 from the PowerPoints. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, let's see how my text messaging programs are doing. Okay, this guy is still hosed. All right, so I'm going to start another one. Oops, I can do it in here. Let me just do it from here. The one that's hosed is this one, so we're going to start a new one. Just leave that one out there. So now I have 3 of them. One's hosed. Eventually my computer will be hosed, but let's see. On one program, I believe I have it. I might have to actually stick it on that one, but the interface to the application is SMS Message. While this is loading, and while that one's loading, I'll go through the source of this particular example, which is slightly different. It's a modified version of it. I have one emulator that appears to be working okay. While the second emulator loads in the background, take a quick look at the source. So actually I have 2 examples I'm going to give you. One is an SMS demo. All it does is load an intent to wait for a message. And so you load it up, then you close it. and then it hangs in the background and waits for a text message. And then when a new text message arrives on the phone, it intercepts, picks it up, and does something funny with it. Or actually, it doesn't really do anything funny with it. Puts it in a toast message is what it does. Shows it for a few minutes and says, "Hey, I got you. I got your message." You know, it doesn't really, but it shows you basically how to use the intent. So I'll make this one available. I don't believe I'm going to want to demo it because I think I'm having issues. We'll see how this works so far. If I am able to get this loaded, I will look at it. But the one that, the example that I want to show you is the one that's called SMS Message, which is very similar to the PowerPoint that I just showed you a few minutes ago. But this one's broken out into a receiver and then a message. So we have an application that sends, a class that sends, a class that receives, and the concept of the SMS. So to look at the SMS, let me close this down a little bit here. And luckily, because I have tested this, I have both apps actually loaded on the two phones, two emulators, on the emulators. Oh, this one is still using this one here. So okay, so it's still using the older version of it, but it still works. So what we're looking at here is the SMS Activity, where we have the button and we have the edit text phone number and a text message. And it's the same. This is actually the same, I believe. Let's just make sure. Except for the status. So to send the message itself to another device, it's going to have the message sent, message delivered, status information that's going to come back from the pending broadcast. Oh, that's right. This one is using a broadcast intent. So the other one is not using this variety. There's two different ways of doing it. This is the one approach. The lecture slide's giving you the other. So if you cut and paste the code, you'll see the two basic forms of doing it. This one's using a broadcast though. So it's going to get the broadcast and add it to the intent, use it for the deliver. So it's going to send PI, delivered PI. It's going to give you a little bit more status information on it, and then add it in with the broadcast receiver. When the SMS has been sent, we're going to get the result set to come back. And with the broadcast, there's a little bit more feedback that you can use for troubleshooting. So you can, it's not, okay, so the basic intent approach is what I showed you last week actually with the intent demo. When one screen was calling the other screen that was calling this screen was calling that screen, or it's interpreting, it's intercepting, which you're not getting as much. It's just stripped down functionality. It's not stripped down functionality, but it's pretty much used just to call things and to send little bits of piece of information, perhaps back and forth between screens, between applications. The broadcast actually is has a higher level wraparound around it. It's built upon the intent, works with the intent, and you're able to broadcast, but you're calling out to a lot of things, not just for example one form, and you're getting a lot more status information that's coming back, and you have a lot more method calls that are associated with it that you can do a little bit more functionality with. It's a little bit, it does the same thing in essence for what we want to accomplish in terms of the SMS application, but it has more capabilities. That's the only way I can describe it. But there's a lot of broadcast reading and intent reading. In fact, some of those links that I showed you at the end of that lecture have some good links to read up on the broadcast concept. But most of the code that is in the sms.java file is for error checking. So looking at the, if the result was okay, then put a toast message out, it was sent, or a generic failure, or no service, or null PDU, or radio's turned off, or all of the different scenarios that could happen. And then our status coming back from the broadcast, because we have the two-way communication on that versus the one-way. So an intent would send something in one direction, but it doesn't normally receive anything back. So now we can actually tell the SMS was delivered or was not delivered. Because after the broadcast goes and checks to see if the port was there and did it actually receive, we get confirmation it comes back. So it's sort of like the difference between UDP and TCP. The broadcast is a TCP kind of connection where and they're both connections, but one of them has got a little bit more management. It's got a little bit more method calls associated with it. More, let's see if we received it. Let's get some confirmation back from the client or vice versa. In our message activity, this is doing nothing more than creating the activity method, creating the activity class, and setting the context view to main. It's not really doing anything at all. We could have easily had stuck maybe this inside an SMS to separate it out. But if you do this, it kind of keeps the abstraction a little easier to see. So, well, what happens when this application starts? It shows main. Sets context. This is hello world, is what this is. It doesn't really do very much. So the receiver, on the receiving end, we're using a content broadcast receiver, and SMS receiver class object has a couple methods in here. We're going to get the SMS message passed in. So we're going to create, use the bundle for it on the intent to get extras, to get the information, to parse it, the message into a string, and take the string object, receive message object, and toast it out onto the screen. So we're going to receive the message, and then we're going to print it out onto the screen, essentially. And this is basically most of the code that we've looked at in the example, except for this was, I guess, more part of the file I/O example that I gave you a few minutes ago, the first one. Alright, so let's see if we at least have a loaded emulator somewhere. How we do? Look at that, it's very good. I'm hoping this one already has it on there, otherwise I'm going to have to take the risk of running it on this emulator to install it. This is 322. So we notice when we load up two emulators, and this is probably the way you're going to test it, I have one on port 5556 that was given automatically. I don't get to choose that. But if I open up another emulator of a different kind, so I created two emulators that are both the 2.3. You can actually run this. This works all the way up to the 4.0, 4.1. So, but make sure they're of the same API version that you're running on the project. The second emulator that I opened up was 558 by default. So if I go into, let me just make sure, because I can set this to, oh yes, I'm going to have to install it. Okay, no problem. We will install. That one's 5558 that needs it. Yeah, it's not on that one. So the way to get to pick which one you want, you go a run configuration, and on a target, select the second. This is hold on one second. This is the -2. I probably should have given them more unique names, but it's okay. It runs. Oh, still trying to load the database. Launcher failed. Well, that's good. I think that is the message on our old. No. Alright, well, I still have one emulator up. And this is the one that doesn't have the app on it, is it? Okay, let me try it one more time and load it on this other one. If I can get it up, I can send a text from the DDMS and not send it from one emulator to the other. Oh, wait a minute. I have it up here. I have one. I have an emulator that's working. Oh, had an emulator that's working. Oh, I still do. Very good. This one's working. Okay, so I'm going to use the DDMS. Let me show you how to do that, actually. And this is good. This is the one that's got it on here, too. I am in business. So I'm running the SS. Ah, perfect. All right, so I don't know if I can minimize this sucker. No, I'm not going to bother. Let's just go here. If I change the view, and you might have the option in the right-hand corner of the screen here, or you can change the perspective up here. Use this window. Open perspective. What we want is the DDMS, which is the communication tool and the manager of the emulator that's going to show us the debugging stuff. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, I gave you a lecture where we put a string in there and we tested the string, a debug string. Please open. It's probably going to take a few minutes. So we put a debug message in. We were able to see the debugging equipment. So here we can actually pick the emulator out of there, see what the status is all about, kill the emulator, which I probably should do. I'm afraid of killing one and then we'll kill them all, which has happened before. So I'm going to leave those bad ones up, but I have one that is working. If I can get into the DDMS manager, I'm going to send a text message to the emulator from the DDMS, which is the best way of doing it at this point. Alright, I'm going to close Eclipse. I can't close Eclipse. I could force quit it. Let's just see which one. I'm gonna try and force quit the emulators. This is just ridiculous. I need to force quit that one. That one is a good one. Ah, here we go. So that one is the good one. We don't want to force quit that one. That one's not responding. Force quit. That one is responding. Force quit emulator. Okay. No, ignore. Okay. Ah, look at that. So I had to force quit one and it worked. Very good. So let's see if this one. This is. Let's just work with one because I have one working. So if I sent a message, I've got one working emulator up here, and you can see up here it's 5556. Here's 5558. He also appears to be working. Depending upon which one is working, on the bottom of the emulator here, I can control it. So I can say incoming number 5551. Actually 5558. And I'm clicked on this one here. The incoming number that I'm sending to this emulator, it's from this emulator. And I'm going to say SMS. I'm going to say hello from 5558. This is Barb. That's a good message. Send. It should send to the emulator that I have highlighted. It's 5556. Here it is, and it has. I don't have the program running on this, obviously. But if I look at the notifications on the top of the screen here, you see that little happy space? Little happy space face up here? Oh, there it goes. I opened it up. Perfect. It says, hello from 5558. This is Barb. So I sent a message to 5558 from 5556 as simulating that it came, from 5558 to 5558, because I think that's what I probably highlighted here. I did. Here it is. I sent it to myself because I highlighted this one. If I want to send one to this one, I highlight that one and I come down here and I send a message to that one. Or I know that this one is 5558 and I'm going to clear this message out of here. And I'm going to leave this guy alone for a second. And I'm going to use the application we just wrote to go to 5558. Say this frozen, this is okay. We'll just leave it like this. Okay, that looks good. Send. I'm sorry. I know, this is interesting. Send. Well, here's my toast down here. It's SMS sent. And it should come back and say something about it was received, or I may have missed it. Unfortunately, that keyboard's in the way right now. And because I don't have anything running up here, I see that it has made it to this emulator. And it came from 555. Well, I don't know what that address that was, but this is that lousy text message I just sent a few minutes ago. Theoretically, if I have text messaging software, here we go. I could send a message and this application is supposed to receive it. Whoops. Oh, good. It does have it. So new text to 5556. So that's what it's asking for. I'm typing and nothing's. Oh, there we go. Is this how it's supposed to work? Yeah. That text. Oh, that technology. No, that textbook. There we go. Send, people. And I wish I can get this board away. How do I get this keyboard away? Uh-oh, I just sent it a couple times. Well, as you can see, it failed actually. The broadcast failed because it shouldn't have picked it up in here. It should have picked it up in here. It should have put it in a toast message. But it didn't put it in a toast message. So I want to say that I have tested this program before and I know it works. So I want to say that the broadcast is failing because it's not, I don't know what's going on. The emulator, I'm going to blame it on the emulator right now. But you may test the program. If it shows up in the notification window, you know your intent and your broadcast isn't working because your program didn't intercept it. Because anyone who sends a text message to this particular phone right now, it should come up into this program. It should be shown here. So it could be a permissions. It could be an emulator issue. But it does work. And as well as we've seen the DDMS actually demonstrated. So a couple of other things related to here, we can also use this for location, for GPS stuff, that I'm going to go through next week actually, because we have to go and I have to have an internet connection, so we have to download something and we have to sign up and register for the GPS stuff, which is a little bit more complicated. Not complicated, it's just a little bit more entailed. But this is probably a nice demo of the concept of using the DDMS to communicate with the emulator. This also works with the VirtualBox as well. You can load that up and use it. Let me just make sure. There was one more example I wanted to show you real quick. I still have time. It's only 4:30. The other example I put out here does not have a corresponding lecture for it, but it's called News, and it was one I was looking for from last week, and couldn't find it last week, but I found it. I found it yesterday, actually. So, and I wanted to show it last week to you, because last week we were talking about internet connectivity, and we had a program that went out and took a JPEG image or PNG image and put it inside of a main window, and this one here actually is kind of interesting. It attaches to a news group, news feed, and it's Yahoo actually. Yahoo. Hopefully this will work. I believe I have it on this emulator that actually is working, which is a good thing to do. So anyway, long story short, it demonstrates the web view, which we've seen already actually. But the web view I did before only downloaded an image. It didn't actually take content, and it wasn't menu driven, and it didn't have a combination of a couple of things that you're going to see in a few minutes. Because it also shows you something with the toast messages and the activity. So it's just one class file. It's not too hard, not too difficult. What this example is doing is on create. It's creating from a web view example. It's going out to, it's loading up, oh, this is the other interesting part. The web view is loading up a file that's loaded locally. So remember before, the first example I showed you was the file, the read file, and I dragged a text file over and I stuck it in the resource directory, one of the resource directories. This is doing a very similar thing, except for I've created an index.html file, and it's loaded in the Android assets directory. So if I go in here, and I go under assets, and I go under the subdirectory www, this does not exist, it was created actually. And I click on this web index.html file. I see, and actually if I look at it from a text editor point of view, it is an HTML file. So this example is kind of interesting because if you don't like using XML, you don't like loading up, making your own interface, the Android API and the Android system supports not only HTML but JavaScript. You can actually write programs in JavaScript. And you can use, in fact, you can see it right here. I have a CSS being used in JavaScript code, and I'll make this example available as well so you can kind of see how the pieces fit together. And there's an image in here. There's a little weight that we're going to see. It's kind of an ugly image, actually. It looks like this. It doesn't spin. It just sits there. It's a static. It's not an animated GIF. But this is an HTML page, and the HTML page is a static file, as we went to before in the file example earlier. And I created it, dragged it, and dropped it, and stuck it into the resource directory. Now you can create your own. Excuse me, it's in the asset, but it's the same concept as the resource. It's available. Because what we're doing is just specifying the path, and the path of the file is right here. So this line right here, let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see what I'm talking about, is the static file. It's not going to, I mean, if you have a script on there, it'll run JavaScript for you. You can actually run PHP, Python scripting languages. You can run a lot of stuff actually from this. So you can take skills you already have, applications you already have, and create a pretty nice little interface, and we'll see in a few minutes how that looks. So on a key down, it goes back. So there's a back button, you know, kind of, well, because the web view component is a web page. So it's expecting connectivity to the internet, it's loading it up, but it's just like loading a file, let's say on your home directory on your computer, on your desktop, double-clicking on an HTML file. So basically the same equivalent. But now it's loaded in the Android app. So here we have a JavaScript that's running. And the JavaScript's going to run from a news client. The news client's going to go out, load a URL, run a JavaScript program that's going to pull the news feeds from Yahoo news feeds and show us from whatever category we select which news we're going to. And it's actually at one point, and I'll tell you when it happens, it just turns into a web browser. But so it's a web browser, web program that's automated by a static HTML page and a main.xml file that's doing absolutely nothing but loading a web view. So if we take a look real quick, which I haven't shown you, the XML, so this was the image for the weight, and this was the index file, and this is the CSS and the GS files. So these are, actually I believe it's using JQuery as well. It's mixing in JQuery with some JavaScript as well in here. So it's really jam-packed in terms of, yeah, it's a JQuery. And it's not, it was done on a, well, it was done in my terminal window, so it's not word wrapping correctly. It's all on one line. But you can download and look at the example and take a read through the jQuery stuff. It's not too bad. There is a project configuration change that needed to be made to support JSON, actually, for which it's using. And so in the project configuration, if I can find, oh, here it is, project preferences, we actually have to set the preferences to load the external library file. And the external library file, let's take a look here. It's under resource, linked library files, linked resources, resource filter. No, hold on, let me find it after the. Here it is. Oh, that's the Java. Oh, okay. No. This does work with. Where did I stick it? I may have stuck it in my path, and it might be loading automatically from a class path. There is a separate jar file that goes with this, and I will put it in a README file so you can know how to install this correctly. But it's using the jar file actually doesn't work with any of this stuff. It's an add-on thing that's being used to what the jar file is doing is called JSON, and it is parsing information. And you know what? It's in this one here. It's in wait a minute. It's in a different example. Okay, so I made two of them. I'm confusing myself right now. I made two of them. One of them is using JSON. One of them isn't. The news is not using JSON. There's no jar file that needs to be added on to that. The one that is using JSON is I did the same thing, and I came up with it. I called it my ITU for kind of a particular reason. I'll get into that in a few minutes. I was experimenting with the concept of taking the ITU LMS and putting it on the Android phone, and you do that easily by using JSON to translate the HTML interface that comes back, and it takes the tags automatically, turns it into XML, and populates the data into forms. So you can actually take a web application and turn it into an Android application quite easily. So, long story short, on that project, I installed JSON. So I think I'll save that one for you for next week because it's only half done right now. I'm waiting for it to be done. So I have to, well, I'm waiting for me to do it. So not quite done yet. But the program source code for here is just running with standard Android API, no add-on products here, no JSON, but it is using and it does work compatibly native with JavaScript, so, and also with jQuery that's being run with it. So if I can break out of this application here, oops, went too far. This one is called News. Hoping it's on here already. It is. Here's the icon for News, actually. News, I put a different icon on there as well. Actually, I pulled that off, stole that from the internet. But I'm not deploying this application. Clear this notification on the top here. Assuming that I have an internet connection, I do, good. This is that HTML page. So nice little interface, looks pretty sophisticated. So, and I didn't have to drag and drop and stick stuff on main.xml. Instead, I used an HTML page that I already had, or I could borrow. There's a little border around the box here. I could probably remove that. But long story short, this is not this is HTML. So if I go add on the categories, it takes me to another part of the same page actually, further down, and it tells me to select a category if I select a category. And I'll tell you in a few minutes when it turns into a regular. This is a web view. If I say top stories, it's probably going to have something on Whitney Houston, probably. Let's see, what she died of. I guess heard about that? Yeah, okay. So let's see, get category. And this button is it just doesn't spin, it's static. So, oops, it had Obama, let's see, house. I'm waiting for Whitney Houston. Houston. Oh, I was trying to click on it. So it was popping through all of the newsfeed stories. No, I didn't get the right one. Oh, I did press it twice. At any moment, this is going to turn into a regular old web page like what you would see, but it's the web view, so it's automatically customized for the Android. But it's just like opening it up in Firefox. It's Yahoo News essentially. It's coming through Yahoo News feeds. So this is essentially nothing more than a website at this point. So the example is kind of interesting because it shows you how to open up text files or HTML files, populate the Android interface with it. Use jQuery, use newsgroup feeds, use Yahoo features. So anything possible, essentially, application-wise. And it presents, and you can set on the web view, you can set the font size, you can set the look and feel of the interface, essentially, programmatically. This is just set on default web view settings. However, it's, let's see, where's the back button? I believe there's like a button to, like a click, but oh well. If we go back, you can see it actually navigates, should navigate. Oops, I went back too far. Well, what I was doing is I was hitting the back. It should navigate back to the main menu. So now it's running an intent example and it's going to have an issue. Okay, so. Anyway, so I will make that code available as well. The purpose of the code was not only to emphasize, because we talked about files today and reading static files, but all files. You can put any file you want in that project, which means if you have a reader for PDF and stuff, let's say you wanted to create an app that opened up a bunch of files and it calls a PDF reader and the file itself is shipped with the app. The only problem with doing that method is it makes the app bigger. So the app might be able to take a little bit longer to install. But simple HTML pages, they are, I was waiting for Whitney Houston. So they're simple. Grease, you can probably see that changing. Yeah. What is this? Trimming. Anyway, so long story short, makes the file size bigger, but HTML files are pretty small. And actually here you can see it here. You can almost get, you can obviously customize a little bit, but you can almost get the feedback to look. And this is just a normal web view. So, all right, well, thanks for putting up with my emulators today. We got through it. I don't know how we did it, but we got through it. But I am, on a side note, I am looking for a bunch. ITU actually has a bunch of projects for Android. I need people, actually, students who want to work for building Android application for, well, as I mentioned before, some of the things I'm experimenting with, to put the LMS essentially on the Android, so students can check their class status, when assignments are due, grades and stuff right from their phone, just like other schools. We also need a couple of Android people to work with Liz Lee, if you're familiar with her, to build a medical Android application. Sounds pretty interesting. That one actually might be better because it'll be more work. I don't believe this Android LMS is going to be that time consuming. But if you're interested, come and see me, and I can get you in touch. And I don't know what the interviewing process is all about or anything. But you'll get like an internship or something and working for ITU to do Android development, which is cool. And yeah, they understand that you guys are students in the class, so they're not expecting you're students. They're not expecting like professional with 20 years of experience or whatever. We're just looking for bodies who are interested in Android, who want to learn more about it, and it's because it'll be a learning experience. as well as getting a job done for us. So let me know if you're interested. Otherwise, we are done for today, and next week we are maybe doing mapping. I'm not sure yet. So we'll see what's on the agenda. But every week I come in, I give you just more stuff, more features. Okay, thanks for watching.